Okay, so here's what the beginning of chapter 9 said. God says, I'm going to start, and I'm just going to go, just wipe out all of these oppressors in the north, the great empires, Phoenicians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. I'm going to just clean them out. I'm going to clean house. He's going to come right down along the Mediterranean coast, and he's going to take care of all of those people, all of those groups that have been oppressing both Judah and Israel. And he makes it clear that he's going to be the one to do it. It's not going to be done by any human means. Now, that's not to say that he doesn't use other humans to carry out his deeds. For instance, who did he choose to take care of the Assyrian Empire? Remember? The Persians were the one that took care of the Assyrian Empire. So that's not to say that he's not going to use other peoples or other empires to take care of these empires, but what he's saying is that it's not going to be done by the impetus or the power of any man, but it's going to be my power working through them in order to do that. So he's going to clean them out. They're no longer going to be able to rule their own countries. There's going to be, other groups or other people will come in to rule their countries. But what was most interesting, and I hope that we didn't lose track of this, is that remember that in verse 7 now, very interesting, in verse 7 of chapter 9, what did he say was going to happen to the Philistines? Not only am I going to take care of them in terms of what they have done to my people, but what did he say? There's going to be a remnant of the Philistines that will be devoted to Jehovah. What this should have been to the Israelites is a signal to them that maybe the construct of God's people is changing. Now, whether they picked up on that or not, nobody knows. It could be, but probably not, because they were so ingrained in their own traditions and their own customs of thinking that they were God's people and only God's people that perhaps they did not pick up on that. But God made it clear that among the Philistines, the great empire of the Philistines, who had been oppressing his people for years and years and years, there's still going to be a remnant that I'm going to have devoted to me. So as we get down to verse 10, and that should have been also, before we get there, remember also that in verse 9, he introduces the concept of Judah and Israel becoming one again. They will no longer be as separate kingdoms. They will no longer have separate rulers, but they will come together with the expectation of a king, a Messiah that is going to be the rule over them. And he introduces them in the sense that this kind of king, however, this is not going to be the pomp and the circumstance that you typically see among the royalty. But it's going to be a very humble ruler. Going to ride in on, what is it, a donkey. Matthew, how did Jesus ride in? Okay, Matthew the 21st chapter, the description of Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem. Okay, so he's looking forward, and it has to be to the time of Messiah. We can't miss that. There is no other time in history when that event took place, at least as recorded in God's Bible. So he's introducing to them that how this kingdom, once it's united, how it's going to be ruled, and by what kind of circumstance it's going to be ruled. And remember, when you read Ephraim in the prophets' messages, that's another name for Israel. Okay, and Jerusalem is obviously Judah. Okay, so we're talking about the total kingdoms, not just necessarily one nation, one tribe, or one city. Okay, so let's pick it up with verse 10. Verse 11, actually, I think it is. Let me see. Yes, verse 11. This phrase, as for you also. Again, a reference to Israel, because remember, he's primarily talking to the kingdom of Judah. But when he says, as for you also, he's saying, okay, but your brothers up north, the northern kingdom, I'm talking to you also. I'm talking to both of you, okay? So Israel and Judah, remember, they were originally under one covenant, Exodus 24, verse 8, that was sealed by the blood of a sacrifice. Okay? And what he's saying to them is that these things that I speak about are not only for Judah, but they are for the larger concept or the larger kingdom of Israel, God's people. He refers, verses 11 and 12, to these prisoners that are still in foreign countries. The reference to the waterless pit, these were the cisterns, the reservoirs, man-made reservoirs that were built to primarily collect rainwater. That's what the purpose of them was. But the interesting thing is that the way he presents it is that it's in such a way that they're more bottle-shaped, so there's no way for the individual to get out of this cistern. Remember, we're talking figurative language here now. There's no escape on your own. You've got to have help. And I'm going to be the one to help you. I'm going to be the one to help you out. Those of you that are now imprisoned, and here again, he's not talking about imprisoned just to foreign rulers. He's also talking about imprisoned to what? What have all of us been imprisoned to at some point in our life? To sins, okay? We've been slaves to sin. And that's what he's referring to here. It's not just imprisoned to foreign, but also imprisoned to our own sins. Because remember, he was still addressing the sins that they had committed and that they needed rescue from. He offers his stronghold, his safety, and his protection. Now, in verse, another interesting kind of a revelation when you really study it, look at verse 12. It says, return to the stronghold. Now, depending upon what version you're reading, most of them say, you prisoners of hope, right? Does anybody have in their version the hope? Either in italics or whatever, okay? There's very few of the publishers that put that the in there. And that's what it should say. That's what it should say, is the hope. And the reason that it should say the hope, let's go to Acts 26, verse 6, so we understand what the prophet is talking about here. Acts 26. And let's read verses 6 and 7. Okay? And now I stand and am judged for what? The hope of what? The promise made by God to our fathers. To this promise our 12 tribes, Israel, earnestly serving God night and day, hope to attain. For this hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused by the Jews. It is the hope that God gave to us because of the promise he made. Okay? And so what Zechariah is referring to here is the hope that should have been in the Israelites about the coming of the Messiah. That's the same hope that we have because it's based on the same promise that the Israelites had regarding the promise that was made many years ago to Abraham at the very beginning. And that is the promise of a protection and of a salvation that could only come because of God's work and God's plan. Okay? So, if you don't have the in there in your translation, in your particular Bible, I would recommend to you that you take your pen or whatever and just write in just a very small the. Put it in front because we're talking about one hope. Not just any hope, not just a hope, but the one very most important hope. Okay? Now, he talks about restoring double. To the Israelites, they're going to be restored double. The punishment as well as the blessing. So they're going to get double the blessing, but they're also going to get double the punishment. Now, this same concept is in Revelation 18, the 18th chapter. We won't go there. But when John the Revelator was talking about Babylon the Great, He was talking about the curse or the punishment being put into a jar and mixed up, and it's going to be double what they had meted out. Okay? So God is talking about here that whatever you have given out, you're going to receive double from me. Okay? Now, verses 13 through 17. Excuse me. This particular part, it's an opinion by most of the scholarship that these verses are speaking specifically of the Grecian invasion by Alexander the Great and the conditions that existed after his conquering of the Israelites. Now, what happened after he was emplaced and empowered and took over the rule of it was that the younger Jews, they left the Jewish Orthodox faith. They either, at the very least, compromised with it to the Greek Orthodoxy, or they just completely abandoned their Jewish faith and went over to Hellenism, which of course is Greek Orthodoxy. So here's what Jehovah says. I will stir up the sons of Zion against the sons of Greece and manifest himself by giving them victory. But then look what follows. I will lead them in battle. I will go forth as lightning. I will blow my own trumpet. You know, the great battle cry. Normally you have someone that blows the trumpet, indicate charge or whatever. But it's going to be Jehovah. I'm going to do that myself because I want it to be clearly understood that I am the one that is taking care of this situation. You don't need to depend on anybody else, and I'm sure there's not a doubt in my mind that the reason that Jehovah is presenting it this way is because his attempts in the past to get the Israelites to see who their God is and who their sustainer is had failed. They had drifted away. They'd given up on him. Okay? So he wants to make it clear that he is the one. When I said I was going to take care of your oppressors, that's what I'm going to do. And that's why he continued to say, I will be the one that will defend them. I will go forth as a whirlwind or as a tornado from the south. Okay? And they could relate to this because this is an indication of the great sandstorms that used to come up from the desert in the south. Okay? He will make them like a warrior's sword. They will devour and destroy all their enemies. Now, verses 14 and 15. When he's talking about trampling, New King James says subdue. ESV says trample down. NSB says trample on. ASV says tread down. The sling stones. That could be interpreted in two different ways. Either he's talking about the literal sling stones that have been fired at them, okay, so that they will be ineffective, right, and they will be trampled on, or what most of the scholars believe is being dealt with here is we're talking about the Grecian warriors themselves, that they will be subdued by the people. They will be completely helpless to do anything in the situation. And then he goes on to indicate what kind of exuberant victory feeling that they will have, as though they're drunk on wine, so to speak, because as they celebrate the victory, they will drink wine and make a great noise. And then there's another reference here, a simile, when it says to drink the blood of the slain. Yes, that's verse 15, okay? There is a reference made then. This reference can be related to what the priest went through whenever there was the animal sacrifice. If you go back to Exodus the 29th chapter and Leviticus the 1st chapter, there's a description there of the priest would bring the blood of the sacrificed animal, would put it in a sacrificial basin, and that's what most of the versions say, a sacrificial basin. And that priest would literally take the blood of the animal and would slap it or sprinkle it around the edge of the boat to make it clear. Okay, that's the sprinkling of the blood. Okay, and so, you know, we said before, the job of a priest was pretty bloody back in the day. Okay, and so the reference here is either only one scholar out of the whole bunch, say that this may indicate a sacred war, but most of the scholars, including Homer Haley, indicate that what this is simply indicating is that it's going to be a hard-fought victory between Jehovah and all the other nations. Okay? That's the reference there that's made. In other words, the oppressors and the despots that have been operating toward Judah and toward Israel are going to be sacrificed. That's how bad they're going to be dealt with. They will be as sacrificial lambs, so to speak. Okay, any question through verses 14 and 15? Now, in verse 16 and 17, he turns again to his faithful followers. He reminds them that their salvation will come only by Jehovah. It will be him that will save them, just as a shepherd does his flock. And again, here's the phrase, in that day. In that day of judgment, in that day that he brings this upon them, when does that refer to? And that expression always refers to what? Always refers to what? The time of the Messiah, okay? The time of the Messiah, or to judgment, all right? So, he's looking forward again to the Messianic age, okay? He says they, meaning his people, would be as the stones or the jewels of a crown. Literally, the Hebrew word means stones. Well, I mean, we call sets in jewelry stones also, so that's not an unusual word to be used, okay? But what they would be is it's a contrast of brilliance and gloriousness, which would be in direct contrast to the sling stones, okay? Which will be trampled upon. These jewels or these stones of his people will never be able to be trampled on, but rather they will hang like a banner. They will be displayed over. They will be glorious. They will be, one version even says, dazzling, okay? They will be displayed over the entire land, right? I will lift them, the SV says, I will lift them on high over the land. Now, there has been some debate on verse 17. For how great is his goodness and how great its beauty or his beauty. Grain shall make the young men thrive, and new wine the young women or virgins. The debate has been about whether this reference is to Jehovah or his people. So what we need to look at is the context of verses 16 and 17. The context of verse 16, remember, context is king, right? We have to remember that what he is talking about, what is he talking about in verse 16 and 17? Verse 16, he will save them. Well, who's he talking about? His people, right? As the flock of his people. The jewels of a crown will be lifted like a banner over his land. He's talking about his people, not a literal banner of jewels, obviously. Okay, remember, apocalyptic literature. A lot of similes, a lot of metaphors, a lot of figurative language, okay? For how great is his goodness and how great is his beauty. Grain shall make the young men, that's talking about people, okay, and the young women, or New American Standard and the ASV use the term virgin. Okay? So clearly the context here is that we're talking about people, okay, and not about Jehovah himself. What this portrays for us here is a period or a condition of prosperity, of strength, beauty, charm, of plenty, and of increase. So the result of all of this vengeance that God takes upon his people and bringing them all back to him is going to be that they're going to be much better off than they have ever been before. Okay? Now, here's a very important thing to remember about the conclusion to chapter 9. There is no record in history as to whether or not this prophecy was ever fulfilled materially or physically to the Jews themselves. There's just no account of it. God does not go any farther in this prophecy, nor you go back to the histories of Chronicles and Kings and Ezra and all the rest of them. There's no specific indication that this was ever fulfilled materially or physically. And here I'm not talking about, they all came back together, but this abundance that the Lord is talking about here, that the prophet is talking about here, was never exposed or never told about. But what is known, here's what is known, and what is undeniably true. Remember when this prophet was talking about the coming, the Messiah, the King, is that it was fulfilled spiritually. Okay? And when was it fulfilled spiritually? When the kingdom of the Messiah came about. All right? Hellenistic philosophy, Greek orthodoxy, Hellenistic philosophy and religion has completely been defeated. Okay? Yes, there are still Greek Orthodox practicing their religion. I understand that. But the power that the Hellenists have over the world doesn't even compare, and I know they consider themselves Christians, but the teachings and the customs and the traditions of Greek Orthodoxy is no more powerful than the Jewish ones are today. We know that the true religion, the true traditions and customs and practices of religion is, of course, the Lord's church and how he specifies it. But spiritual fullness and completeness has been supplied abundantly to people. How was that done? Well, what does John, the first chapter, verses 14 through 17 talk about? Talks about the Word, what? Coming. He was the fullness of him. He was the fullness of grace to grace. Right? Colossians, the first chapter, 19 through 20, and chapter 2, 9 through 10. He was the fullness of whom? Of what? Deity, or the Godhead, depending upon what version you're reading. Okay? Galatians, the fourth chapter, verses 4 through 5. Okay? The fullness, when the fullness of the time came, he came to us. He came in the fullness of time. God sent him in the fullness of time. Okay? And Ephesians, the first chapter, verses 22 through 23, it's the fullness of him, capital H, meaning God, meaning Jehovah, meaning the Lord. Okay? So when the Messiah came, when the Savior came, Jesus Christ came, he fulfilled this prophecy in the spiritual sense. And that's what was intended by Zechariah in the first place. Okay? Now, Genesis, the 12th chapter, verse 3, remember? It said that through Abraham's seed, all nations would be blessed, all people would be blessed. In Galatians, the 3rd chapter, 26 to 29, what does it say? We are all what? We are all sons of God through Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither Greek nor Gentile. We are all one in Christ. See? That's when this prophecy was fulfilled. When Christ arrived on the scene, this prophecy was fulfilled. Okay? Any questions on chapter 9? Any clarification? Everything's clear as mud, right? No. Listen, when you really take some time and think about what's in it, and you do some research, and I hope you're doing some research on your own also, it's really very, very faith building and interesting to look in depth into this. And this is what we hope to accomplish as we begin next year, this study of the life of Christ. Really, when you get into the depth of what these things mean, it is so powerful in terms of building your faith and knowing that you are in the right place. And that's exactly what Zechariah wanted us to understand from his particular writing. Okay, so let's turn our attention to chapter 10, because chapter 10 is actually a follow-on to chapter 9, because now the prophet is going to talk about the restoration of Judah and Israel. Now, there is a promise of prosperity and blessing, and it's enlarged, but there's no new promise made in chapter 10. He's simply expounding upon and enlarging what he has previously said about the prosperity that they are going to enjoy. But first he's going to remind them of something. He's going to remind them that it's to Jehovah that they should have been turning to ask for the blessings. Ask ye of the Lord. Ask the Lord. It's an exhortation to ask of Jehovah for their needed blessings. The latter rains are reference to spring rains. What do you need the spring rains for? To make sure you have a great harvest. Okay? What had they been doing in the past? What had their ancestors been doing? What had they been doing? They'd been asking their false idols, their false gods. The teraphim are these. They're actually like household idols that you could have sitting on your desk. They've been talking to diviners, who speak, of course, falsely of the future, dreamers, who do nothing but confuse people with their false dreams. All of them had led to a false hope, and that's what Jehovah is reminding them of. And because they had listened to these false gods, these false idols, and obeyed them, that's why Jehovah had sent them into captivity. Because they didn't understand who they should have been placing their allegiance with, and who was really the one who could provide them the blessings that they wanted. They had gone into captivity, and they had been afflicted or placed in a circumstance just like sheep wander and stray without a shepherd. Sheep, if they don't have a shepherd with them, they're going to go all over the place. Okay? And that's exactly what he's reminding them of. So verses 3 and 4, because they had rejected Jehovah, he was the one that casted off their king. He's the one that had left them to the mercy of the foreign ruler. God's anger had been kindled against now the heathen oppressors. The shepherds in these two verses are referring to the spiritual leaders. Male goats are goat herds. Okay? What is the male goat? Is the what? The leader of that herd, right? Leader of that. If you want to refer to it as a flock, that's fine too. What he's talking about here is the civil leaders. Okay? So he had punished all of those who had followed all these false gods, both leaders and followers. Now, the house of Judah, we're still in verses 3 and 4. The house of Judah here is not referring to the temple, okay? Not referring to any physical thing. Here the house of Judah is referring to his people. But again, based upon chapter 9, verse 10, This is a reference to both houses. Okay? We're talking now about both houses, both Judah and Israel. From him, the house of Judah, will come a different leadership. Cornerstone. What does Ephesians 2:20 say? Who's the cornerstone? Christ is the chief cornerstone. Remember, you've got to have 4 cornerstones for that building to stay in place. All right? A tent peg. Isaiah, the 22nd chapter, verses 23 through 24. On him will hang all the glory of his father's house, the offspring and posterity, firmly. The tent peg here is a reference to, in their homes, they would hang pegs up at the entrance, and they would hang all their valuables, and whether it's a tunic or whatever, onto these tent pegs so they would stay firmly in place. They would be where they knew that they would be safe and they would be able to find them. The battle bow is obvious. Okay? The battle bow is obvious. You go into battle with your bow. And every ruler, Psalm 110, okay? What does Psalm 110 say about a priest forever? In the order of whom? Melchizedek, okay? And he will judge all nations. So here we're definitely talking about the house of Judah being led by the Messiah, led by the King, led by the one and only Jesus Christ. See? Any questions through verse 4? Okay, verses 5 through 7. He continues to remind them of what condition that they're going to be in when they do come back together. They're going to be thoroughly equipped. God's people are going to be thoroughly equipped. And again, think of it from now on as being both under one, okay? Judah and Israel together, right? They will be able to defend themselves against all enemies. Why? Because the Lord will be with them. Okay? Now, again, and don't always think of it as a physical. We're talking about a spiritual warfare now, okay? As mighty men, they will battle and put to shame all their enemies. Jehovah will bring them back from captivity as though they had never been cast off. In other words, he's going to restore them back to the condition that they were in. He will show mercy. He will show compassion upon them. Now, the interesting part of this is that there have been many that have taught over the years that the 10 northern... How many of you ever heard the concept about the 10 northern tribes were lost forever? Right? You heard about that? Well, that's absolutely not true and never has been true. Let's go to Ezekiel. Okay? And remember, Ezekiel is also, much of it is apocalyptic literature. Okay? But in Ezekiel, the 37th chapter, let's look at verse 11 first. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones, remember the bones, these dry bones, okay? Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. The whole house of Israel. Yes, they indeed say, our bones are dry, our hope is lost, and we ourselves are cut off. Okay, they're feeling like they've been cut off. But let's continue. Go down to verse 16. As for you, son of man, take a stick for yourself and write on it, for Judah and for the children of Israel, his companions. Then take another stick and write on it, for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel, his companions. Then join them one to another for yourself into one stick, and they will become one in your hand. And when the children of your people speak to you, saying, will you not show us what you mean by these? Verse 19 is the key verse here. Okay? Verse 19. Say to them, thus says the Lord God, surely I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, Israel, and the tribes of Israel, his companions, and I will join them with it with the stick of who? Judah, and make them one stick, and they will be one in my hand. God never forgot about those 10 tribes of Israel, despite what some have taught. They were never lost forever. God knew exactly where they were, and he told in by his prophets exactly that he was going to take care of them at the appointed time. And that's exactly what this reference here is about. Okay? Is that all these, let's refer to them as families, because it was 12 families. All these families are going to be brought back together, and they're going to be as one. By the way, Ezra, the 6th chapter, verses 17 and 21, also deal with this same concept of Israel was never totally lost. So here's the important point. The ultimate and complete fulfillment of this part of the prophecy can only be seen in the Messianic age. When Judah and Ephraim, Israel, the house of Joseph, were joined together as a spiritual union. Everybody get that concept? Eh? What Zechariah is dealing with here is a spiritual situation, a spiritual warfare, a spiritual condition. And here's how we're going to see how us lowly Gentiles get into this whole mix. Okay? Remember what he said about the Philistines? Didn't he say that the Philistines, those are Gentiles, okay? They're not Israelites. Those Gentiles are going to be for me also. There's going to be a remnant of them, okay? Now, continuing in verses 8 and 10. Jehovah God will whistle, okay, for his scattered people from all directions who will return to him. He's not demanding that you all come. What he's saying is, come to me, those of you who understand what this is all about, basically. Okay? Because remember, they didn't all return, but there was a remnant that did come. There was a remnant that did return to him. Okay, now here's some figurative language. Egypt and Assyria are the types, okay, the types that refer to the captivity that, of course, the full nation had to undergo. Okay? Of course, this was partially fulfilled when Israel and Judah physically returned from the captivity. We know that at different points in time, there were remnants of those that were in captive, either in Babylon or Assyria or Egypt. In fact, the whole nation of Israel was brought out of captivity in Egypt. But remember, even later, they went back into captivity in Egypt. When they tried to make an alliance with them, Egypt turned on them and made them slaves again to them. Okay? So this is a type of Israel's captivity, which was, of course, partially fulfilled when they physically returned from captivity. But what's important here is that it was completely filled in the Messianic age. We already referred to Galatians, the 6th chapter, verse 16, and then, of course, 3:26 through 29. We are all sons and what? Heirs, okay? We're all sons and heirs to the promise. Those that have been baptized into Christ have become the redeemed, so that there's neither slave nor free, there's neither Greek nor Jew. We are all one in Christ. Now, the reference to Gilead was east of the Jordan. Lebanon was west and north of the river. Those were the northern sections of the 10 tribes' territory. What this symbolizes is the restoration of Israel to its proper place. Okay? But because God's people are those of a spiritual birth, John, the 3rd chapter, verse 3 and 5, you must be born again. Okay? They will increase in number so much that the original Canaan, that land that they originally had, won't be able to accommodate them all. So now we've got a concept, and God's people should be seen, Israel should be seen, there's a different concept here, because we're not just talking about those of us who have been physically loyal to him and being brought back together, but somehow we're going to increase in number by those that are outside of our community, so to speak. But they will be so many that we no longer can accommodate them, and they will become as numerous as they were before, even beyond that. Verse 8. Now, let me finish up chapter 10 here real quick. Okay? Now, verses 11 and 12. The Lord will be with his people. He'll be delivering them in times of distress and bringing down their oppressors. He would dry up the Nile. And remember, the Nile was Egypt's main source of the whole life. Everything they had, all their power, because they controlled the Nile, they controlled all the power. Okay? But he would bring an end to Egypt's power. He would bring down the Assyrian Empire. How did he do that? The Persians took out the Assyrians. Now, both of these are symbolic, of course, of all the powers which sought to destroy and enslave Israel. At the same time, and now we're in verses 11 and 12, end of chapter 10. At the same time, Jehovah will strengthen his people, and that means his people are now all of the redeemed, Jew and Gentile, who will live in his name, whose name and his name stands, of course, for all that he is. Power, wisdom, glory. And that is to be theirs because of who Jehovah God is. And when you align yourself with Jehovah God, he shares with you his power, his glory, and his salvation. And that's the only way that you can continue to live and prosper as an individual. Okay? Yes, Brian. Right. Right. That's right. That's the only time that it ever took place. The only time that you could ever see that took place. Okay? Thank you very much. Remember, 11 and 12, so study up on 11 and 12 next week. Thank you very much.